Right now, at this exact second, your body is producing real drugs, not in response to a disease, not in response to an injury, in response to an expectation. And the part that keeps me up at night is that AI does the exact same thing. In 2002, the New England Journal of Medicine published a study that should have fundamentally changed how we think about medicine, the body, and increasingly, about artificial intelligence. So 180 patients with severe knee osteoarthritis, people in enough pain that they had difficulty getting out of chairs, were divided into 3 groups. The first group received real arthroscopic surgery. The second received a different version of real arthroscopic surgery. The third group received 3 small incisions in the skin, no instruments inside the joint, no cartilage touched, nothing done. The surgeon mimicked the sounds of the real procedure. The patients were sewn up and sent to recovery. 2 years of follow-up. The same outcome in all 3 groups. The patients who received the fake surgery reported the same reduction in pain, the same improvement in function, the same quality of life gains as the patients who received the real procedure. At some time points, the placebo group did better. The lead investigator's conclusion, published in the journal, the entire driving force behind this billion-dollar surgical industry is the placebo effect. I want to start there, not because surgery is the main story, because that result tells us something about what kind of system the human body actually is. And once you understand what kind of system it is, and once you look at what kind of system a large language model is, you realize you are looking at the same architecture running on 2 different substrates, the 2 prediction machines, one biological, one computational, both of them generating real, measurable outputs from inputs that contain no active ingredient, both of them healing or degrading based not on what was actually delivered, but on what was predicted would be delivered. I want to start there, not with a theory, not with a mechanism, not with a percentage. With that image, a person in a recovery room, genuinely healing, genuinely improving, from a procedure that consisted of 3 small incisions and a performance. No instruments entered the joint, no cartilage was removed, no biological intervention of any kind was made. The surgeon made cuts on the surface of the skin, mimicked the sounds of real surgery, and sewed the patient back up. And 2 years later, that patient's outcomes were indistinguishable from the patients who had the real procedure. This happened. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It involved 180 patients, and I think it is one of the most important experiments in the history of science, not because it tells us something about surgery, but because it tells us something about what we are, about the kind of system the human body actually is, about the relationship between what a system believes is happening to it and what actually happens to it as a result. I also want to tell you about something I've been thinking about for the last year, because there is a second system that does the same thing. A system that produces real, measurable, high-quality outputs, not because its inputs were correct, but because it was given a particular kind of expectation about what its outputs should be. A system whose performance changes dramatically based on what it has been primed to predict, independent of any change in the actual information it has access to. A system that, like the patient in the recovery room, can be healed or harmed by something that never chemically happened. That system is AI, and once you see the parallel, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the mechanism underneath the placebo effect, and once you understand the mechanism underneath how large language models generate their outputs, you realize that you are looking at the same operation running on 2 different substrates. You are looking at 2 prediction machines, built from completely different materials, being shaped by completely different processes, doing the same fundamental thing, generating real outcomes from false inputs, because the prediction of the outcome is itself a mechanism that produces the outcome. Let me tell you what a placebo actually is, not the pop science version, not the idea that positive thinking makes you feel better or that suggestible people convince themselves they are well when they are not. The actual neurobiological reality, which is far stranger and far more significant than the folk version most people carry around. A placebo is an inert substance or procedure that produces a measurable biological response, not a subjective report of feeling better, not a psychological impression that things have improved. A measurable, physical, verifiable biological response. Endorphins released, dopamine synthesized, immune activity modulated, neural pathways activated. Real chemistry, in real bodies, are initiated by something that contained no active ingredient, and performed no biological action. The first person to put a number on this was an American physician named Henry Beecher. In 1955, Beecher analyzed the results of 15 different studies and published what became the founding document of placebo research. His conclusion was simple and disturbing. Regardless of what condition the patients had, regardless of what the placebo consisted of, approximately 1/3 of patients showed a significant therapeutic response to an inactive treatment. 1 in 3, across 15 different studies, across different diseases, different populations, different procedures. 1 in 3 people got better from nothing. Now I want to be precise about what Beecher was measuring, because the distinction matters enormously for what comes later. He was not measuring people who said they felt better while remaining objectively the same. He was measuring clinical improvement, measurable, observable, assessable change in the condition being treated, the kind of change a doctor would note in a chart. Real improvement from no real treatment. That was 1955. In the 70 years since, the research has not weakened the finding. It has strengthened it, deepened it, and made it progressively more difficult to dismiss. What we know now about the neurobiological machinery underneath the placebo response is, in my view, one of the most underappreciated bodies of knowledge in modern science. And understanding it, really understanding it, at the level of mechanism, not at the level of anecdote, changes something fundamental about how you understand both medicine and artificial intelligence. Here is where the mechanism begins. In 1978, a group of researchers did something that seems simple in retrospect, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time. They gave patients a placebo for pain relief, and then they gave a different group of patients the same placebo plus a drug called naloxone. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist. Its entire function is to block the opioid receptors in the brain. If you inject it into someone who has taken morphine, the morphine stops working almost immediately. If you inject it into someone experiencing genuine pain relief, the pain comes back. It is the pharmacological off switch for the endogenous opioid system. Yet what the researchers found was this. The naloxone blocked the placebo's pain-relieving effect. The sugar pill stopped working when the opioid system was turned off. This meant only one thing. The sugar pill had been working by activating the opioid system. The placebo was causing the brain to release its own endorphins, its own natural painkillers, into the system. The inert substance had triggered a genuine pharmacological cascade. The fake drug was working through real chemistry, just chemistry the body made itself in response to the expectation of relief, rather than chemistry delivered from outside. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the implications run very deep. When someone takes a painkiller and their pain decreases, we assume the decrease is caused by the drug's chemical action on their biology, and in many cases, it is. But in a significant number of cases, the drug's primary action is to tell the brain that pain relief is coming, and the brain then manufactures the pain relief. The pill is the signal. The brain is the pharmacy. The drug is something the body makes in response to the prediction that it will receive a drug. The opioid finding opened a door. Once researchers knew the brain could manufacture its own analgesics in response to a placebo, they started looking for other systems that might work the same way. And what they found, progressively, over the following 3 decades, to us was that the answer is almost everywhere you look. Parkinson's disease is caused by the progressive death of dopamine-producing neurons in a region of the brain called the substantia nigra. The defining feature of the disease is that the brain cannot produce enough dopamine. Dopamine is not a detail in this disease. It is the center of it. The motor symptoms, the tremor, the rigidity, the bradykinesia, all of it follows from the insufficient dopamine. No, this is not a disease where you would expect a sugar pill to do anything meaningful, because the underlying problem is biological and degenerative, not psychological or perceptual. And yet, a research team led by Raúl de la Fuente Fernandez at the University of British Columbia conducted a study in 2001, published in the journal Science, that should probably be more famous than it is. They used positron emission tomography, a form of brain imaging that can measure actual neurochemical activity in real time, to look at what happened in the brains of Parkinson's patients when they were given a placebo and told it was an anti-Parkinsonian drug. The specific thing they were measuring was endogenous dopamine release in the striatum, the brain's own dopamine production, not dopamine from a drug. The patients who received the placebo and expected motor improvement released measurable quantities of dopamine in their striatum. The expectation of improvement activated the damaged dopaminergic system. The brain began manufacturing the neurotransmitter whose absence was causing the disease in response to the prediction that a drug which would stimulate dopamine was about to work. The prediction preceded the chemistry. The prediction caused the chemistry. This is not a small finding. Parkinson's patients have fewer dopamine-producing neurons. They cannot fully compensate for the damage. And yet, when given a convincing enough expectation of treatment, they release dopamine. The prediction machine found resources in a damaged system that the disease had made scarce and deployed them in response to a forecast rather than a pharmaceutical signal. There is a third system that extends the finding even further, and into territory that should be philosophically uncomfortable for anyone who holds a clean separation between mind and body. In 1975, a psychologist named Robert Otter and an immunologist named Nicholas Cohen published a study that founded an entire new field. They were working with rats. They gave the rats a saccharin solution, sweet, pleasant, completely inert, paired with injections of a drug called cyclophosphamide. Cyclophosphamide is an immunosuppressant. It suppresses the immune system. When paired repeatedly with a sweet drink, it should do nothing except condition the rats to dislike the drink. But Otter and Cohen were not studying taste aversion. They noticed something unexpected. Rats that had received the paired conditioning and were then given just the saccharin solution, no drug, showed immune suppression. The sweet drink, with no active ingredient, produced measurable suppression of the immune system. The immune system had learned to respond to a conditioned signal. The brain had apparently communicated something to the immune system that caused it to behave differently in response to a taste. The mind-immune connection, which had been philosophically suspected for centuries and scientifically dismissed for most of the 20th century, had been demonstrated in a laboratory. This study founded the field of psychoneuroimmunology. It took another decade before it started getting mainstream scientific attention, and another decade after that before its implications began filtering into clinical medicine. We are, arguably, still in the early stages of reckoning with what it means. What it means, at minimum, is this: the immune system is not autonomous. It is in communication with the brain. It can receive signals from the brain that modify its behavior, and those signals can be triggered by learned associations, by expectation, by prediction. The placebo effect is not confined to the perception of pain, which is admittedly a highly psychological experience. It operates on biological systems that were previously assumed to be beyond the reach of cognition. There is no clean line between the brain's predictions and the body's biology. The predictions are biology. The finding that really cemented this for me, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most recent and the most precise, came in 2018. A team of researchers published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences involving renal transplant patients. These are patients who have received a kidney transplant and must take immunosuppressant drugs continuously to prevent the body from rejecting the organ. The immune suppression is not optional or temporary. It is the difference between keeping the kidney and losing it. The researchers conditioned these patients by pairing their immunosuppressant medication with a distinctively flavored drink over a series of sessions. Then they tested what happened when the patients received the flavored drink without the medication. Their immune systems suppressed themselves. In humans, with a genuinely critical health stake involved. The conditioned signal, the flavor, was sufficient to partially reproduce the pharmacological action of the drug. A drink made the immune system behave as if a drug had been taken, because the association between the two had been trained into the system deeply enough to run independently. I want to give you a number here that I think makes the scale of this clearer than any description can. The brain processes information at an estimated 11 million bits per second through its various sensory and physiological monitoring systems. Of that 11 million bits, approximately 40 bits per second reach the threshold of conscious awareness. 40 out of 11 million. Everything else, every piece of information the nervous system is using to monitor the body's state, to generate predictions about what the body's state should be, and to execute the physiological programs that drive the body toward those predicted states, is happening completely outside of your awareness and completely outside of your control in any direct sense. The The placebo effect is not operating on the 40 conscious bits. It is operating on the 11 million. It is reaching into the prediction machinery that runs the body below the level of awareness and changing what that machinery is predicting should happen next. Now I want to tell you about the man who has dedicated his career to the strangest edge of this phenomenon, because his work is where the placebo effect stops being remarkable and starts being genuinely destabilizing. Ted Kaptchuk is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the director of the world's only dedicated program in placebo studies. He is also, unusually for a Harvard professor of medicine, an acupuncturist by original training. With a degree from an institute in Macau, he spent years studying whether the healing effects of acupuncture were due to the needles or to the ritual, the relationship, the expectation, the placebo. He concluded, carefully and rigorously, that the placebo was doing more than most of medicine had admitted. The study that made him famous, the one that still makes people stop and reread the abstract twice to make sure they understood it, was published in PLOS 1 in 2010. The standard assumption of placebo research until that point was that for a placebo to work, the patient must not know they are receiving a placebo. Deception was considered structurally necessary. The whole logic of placebo seemed to require a patient who believed they were receiving a real treatment. Without the belief, there should be no effect. The deception was the mechanism. Kaptchuk decided to test this assumption directly. He recruited patients with irritable bowel syndrome, a chronic condition that is painful, debilitating, and highly responsive to placebo. He divided them into two groups. One group received no treatment. The other group received pills delivered in bottles clearly labeled in plain text with the words, placebo pills. The researchers told the patients explicitly that the pills were inert, that they contained no active ingredient, and also that placebos often have healing effects. Fully informed, no deception whatsoever. The patients who knew they were taking placebos reported twice as much symptom relief as the no treatment group, not slightly more, twice as much. I think this is one of the most important experimental results in medicine in the last 50 years, because it eliminates the obvious explanation for the placebo effect. The one that preserves a clean materialist worldview is that patients are simply deceived. They think they received a treatment, so they report feeling better because they want to please the doctors, or because they are susceptible to suggestion, or because they confuse the natural regression of symptoms with treatment effects. All of these are real confounds, but they all require that the patient believes they received a real treatment. Kaptchuk's patients did not believe they received a real treatment. They knew explicitly that they received inert pills, and they got significantly better, which means the mechanism is not belief in the traditional conscious sense. The mechanism is something else, something that operates below the level of explicit belief, something that responds to cues, to rituals, to the structure of a treatment encounter, to the act of taking a pill, independently of what the conscious mind has been told about that pill. I will tell you what that something is in a moment. But first, I want to spend time on the finding that, to me, is the most consequential of all, because it is not about a niche phenomenon in pain management or gastroenterology. It is about the most widely prescribed class of drugs in the developed world. Irving Kirsch is a psychologist at Harvard Medical School, and he has been called the most controversial scientist in psychiatry, not because he is fringe, not because his methods are poor, because his results, derived from rigorous meta-analysis of clinical trial data, are deeply uncomfortable for a pharmaceutical industry that generates hundreds of billions of dollars from the class of drugs he studied. In 1998, Kirsch and a graduate student named Guy Saperstein published a meta-analysis of antidepressant clinical trials. They were not initially interested in antidepressants. They were interested in understanding the size of the placebo effect. The antidepressant data was just one data set to analyze. What they found changed the direction of Kirsch's career. The placebo response accounted for approximately 75% of the response to antidepressants. In other words, 3/4 of what antidepressants appeared to produce, 3/4 of the improvement in depression scores that patients experienced, was also present in the placebo groups. The drug itself, the active chemical, the serotonin reuptake inhibition, or whatever the specific pharmacology of the compound, also appeared to account for at most 25% of the total effect. And even that 25% was questionable, for reasons I will get to. This was controversial enough to generate a decade of debate. Kirsch kept going. In 2008, he and colleagues published a second, more comprehensive meta-analysis in PLOS Medicine, and this time using data obtained directly from the Food and Drug Administration, including the unpublished trials that drug companies had not chosen to put in the scientific literature. This matters enormously because drug companies are permitted to submit all of their trial data to the FDA for regulatory approval, but only publish the trials with positive results. The published literature, Kirsch and colleagues showed, significantly overestimated the efficacy of antidepressants. When you include all the data, including the negative trials that were quietly shelved, the drug placebo difference on the standard measure of depression severity was 1.8 points. The threshold for clinical significance, as defined by the UK's National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, is 3 points. The drugs, at the population level, were not clearing the bar for meaningful benefit. There was more. Kirsch looked at the type of drug used in each trial. There were SSRIs, the most commonly prescribed modern antidepressants. There were tricyclics, an older class. There were others, categorized as other antidepressants. And then there was a fourth category that nobody had previously paid close attention to. Trials in which drugs that are not antidepressants at all, tranquilizers, thyroid medications, were given to depressed patients to see if they helped. And they did help. They helped just as much as the actual antidepressants. Drugs with completely different mechanisms, some of which do not interact with serotonin at all, some of which decrease serotonin rather than increase it, produce the same antidepressant response, because 75% of the response was not coming from the chemistry. It was coming from the expectation of being treated. I want you to sit with the implications of this finding before we move on, because I think most people hear this result and process it at a shallower level than it deserves. The standard response is something like, "So, antidepressants are overhyped." That is true, but it is the smallest version of what this data is telling us. The deeper version is this: millions of people who have taken antidepressants have had their mood, their functioning, their experience of daily life changed in real and documented ways. This improvement is not imaginary. These are not patients confusing feeling slightly better with genuinely better. The clinical improvement is real and measurable. And the Kirsch data says that most of that real, measurable, clinically observed improvement was generated not by the drug's pharmacological action, but by the patient's brain in response to the prediction of receiving an effective treatment. The brain manufactured the antidepressant effect from the expectation of an antidepressant without the active ingredient, not as a lesser, degraded, substitute version of the real improvement, as the same improvement, at the same magnitude, through a different mechanism. The prediction machine ran the recovery program, not because it was tricked in a simple sense, because the prediction was sufficient to activate the systems that produce the recovery. And here is the detail that I think is most important for understanding the mechanism, as opposed to just understanding the magnitude. When researchers have studied what makes the placebo response stronger or weaker, they have found that it has nothing to do with the patient being particularly credulous, or particularly psychological, or particularly susceptible to suggestion in any general sense. It has to do with the quality and intensity of the prediction. Larger pills produce stronger effects than smaller ones, in certain contexts, because they generate a stronger prediction of potency. Injections produce stronger effects than pills because they generate a stronger prediction of medical intervention. 2 pills produce stronger effects than 1 in some studies. More frequent dosing produces stronger effects in some studies. The color of the pill matters. In one research tradition, red pills produce different analgesic effects than blue pills because color conveys different predictions about the type and strength of the effect. None of this has anything to do with pharmacology. All of it has to do with the richness and conviction of the healing prediction that the dosing ritual activates. Kirsch's conclusion, stated plainly in his subsequent book, is that the serotonin theory of depression, the idea that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance that antidepressants correct, is, in his words, as close as any theory in the history of science to having been proved wrong. The most widely prescribed psychiatric medications in the world appear to work primarily not by fixing a chemical imbalance, but by being convincing enough treatments that the brain activates its own healing systems in response to the prediction of recovery. I am not saying no one should take antidepressants. I am not saying they don't help anyone. Kirsch's own data shows they have real benefits for people with very severe depression. I am saying something about the mechanism. The primary mechanism through which antidepressants appear to produce their benefits is not the one on the label. The primary mechanism is the one that does not require the drug at all. Now I need to tell you about the other side of this. Because if the prediction of healing produces healing, then the prediction of harm produces harm. And the evidence for this is, if anything, even more disturbing than the evidence for placebo, because it is harder to dismiss as wishful thinking or suggestibility. The word is nocebo. From the Latin, it means I shall harm. It is the placebo effect's mirror image, and it operates through the same mechanism in the same systems, just in the other direction. Walter Cannon was a Harvard physiologist who spent decades studying the stress response. He is best known for coining the phrase fight or flight. But in 1942, he published a paper that had nothing to do with laboratory stress experiments. He called it voodoo death, and it was an attempt to provide a scientific account of a phenomenon he had been collecting reports of for years. Cases documented by anthropologists and physicians across multiple cultures and continents of apparently healthy individuals dying after being cursed, not dying of disease, dying because a figure of authority in their culture pointed at them and told them they would die. Cannon's explanation was physiological rather than supernatural. He proposed that the belief in the certainty of death activated the sympathetic nervous system so completely and so continuously that the resulting physiological state sustained extreme activation of the fight-or-flight response was itself fatal. The heart, the blood pressure, the hormonal cascade, all driven to extremes by sustained terror and the absolute conviction of impending death. The belief was the pathogen, and the prediction was the disease. One of Cannon's cases is particularly striking. A young Aboriginal Australian man fell seriously ill after a witch doctor performed a bone-pointing ritual, a death curse, in his direction. He deteriorated rapidly, in the manner consistent with the physiological state Cannon described. He was brought to a hospital. He continued to decline. Then someone located the witch doctor and explained that a mistake had been made, that no curse had been intended, that the ritual had not been directed at this man. The witch doctor performed a counter-ritual. The young man's condition reversed almost immediately. He recovered. The prediction of death was producing death. The retraction of the prediction reversed the process. This is the extreme end of the nocebo. But the phenomenon operates throughout medicine in ways that are measurable and consequential long before we reach voodoo death. You might be inclined to regard the bone-pointing case as an extreme of a belief system foreign to your own. I want to disabuse you of that comfort by pointing you to a case from 1992, documented by physician Clifton Meador in the Southern Medical Journal. A man had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. He was given a prognosis of months to live. His family was told. His doctor was certain. The man deteriorated. He died within the predicted time frame. At autopsy, the pathologists found a very small tumor, far too small to have caused his death, nowhere near the vital structures that would have needed to be compromised for the death to be medically explained by the cancer. The cancer did not kill him. Meador's conclusion was that the man's absolute conviction of his own imminent death, medically induced by a physician in a modern hospital with no supernatural element, had produced the physiological cascade that killed him. The nocebo effect. In a Western hospital room, the prediction machine given a death sentence and executing it faithfully. There was a study involving patients given nothing but saline, salt water, who were told they were receiving chemotherapy. They vomited. Some of them lost their hair, nausea, and alopecia from a substance with no pharmacological action whatsoever, because the brain's prediction that chemotherapy was entering the body triggered the responses associated with chemotherapy. There is a study that replicated the nocebo in a purer experimental form. Japanese high school boys with known sensitivity to lacquer trees, the Asian equivalent of poison ivy, were blindfolded. Researchers brushed one arm with leaves from a lacquer tree but told the boys they were harmless chestnut leaves. They stroked the other arm with harmless chestnut leaves but told the boys they were lacquer tree leaves. Within minutes, the arm the boys believed had been exposed to the poisonous tree turned red, became bumpy, and developed the characteristic itchy rash of a reaction to the allergen. The arm that had actually been exposed showed no reaction in most cases. The prediction of allergic contact caused an allergic reaction. The prediction of safety suppressed one. Same physiology, same biology, different predictions, different chemistry. There is the data on sexual dysfunction and beta blockers. In a study comparing two groups of patients taking the same medication, patients who were told that erectile dysfunction was a possible side effect of the drug reported it at rates 2 to 3 times higher than patients who were not told. Same drug, same bodies, triple the side effects from the verbal information alone. There is the statin story, which is a Nocebo case study at population scale. In 2013, a British medical journal article raised questions about the side effect profile of statin drugs, the cholesterol-lowering medications taken by tens of millions of people worldwide. The article was widely covered in the British media. Within 6 months of the media coverage, an estimated 200,000 patients in the UK stopped taking their statins. A subsequent review estimated that this stopping, driven by fear of side effects generated by reading about side effects rather than experiencing them, would cause at least 2,000 cardiovascular events over the following decade that would not otherwise have occurred. The nocebo effect, scaled to a media cycle, was literally fatal. And then there is the data that I find most philosophically significant. The Framingham Heart Study produced a finding that researchers have not quite known what to do with. Women who believed they were prone to heart disease were nearly 4 times more likely to die of heart disease than women with equivalent objective risk profiles who did not hold that belief. Not somewhat more likely, 4 times. This difference could not be accounted for by blood pressure, cholesterol, weight, age, family history, or any other standard cardiovascular risk factor. The only variable that predicted it was the belief. The prediction of a cardiovascular event was, somehow, producing cardiovascular events at 4 times the baseline rate. What is happening in all of these cases? What is the mechanism that connects a belief, which seems like a purely cognitive event, to a biological outcome, which seems like a purely physical one? The answer is one of the most important ideas in neuroscience of the last 30 years, and it has a name: the free energy principle. The man who formulated it is Karl Friston, a neuroscientist at University College London, who is, by some measures of academic citation, one of the most influential scientists alive. And his framework, which begins with a deceptively simple premise and builds into a theory of considerable mathematical complexity, explains both the placebo effect and the nocebo effect as necessary consequences of what the brain actually is. The brain, in Friston's framework, is not a passive receiver of sensory information. It is an active prediction machine. Its primary function, the one evolution has been optimizing for hundreds of millions of years, is to maintain a model of the world and to minimize the gap between what it predicted would happen and what actually happened. The brain is running, continuously, a generative model of the body and of the environment. It is forecasting what is coming and then comparing those forecasts to the incoming sensory data and updating the model to reduce the discrepancy. This framework is called predictive processing, and the central insight is that perception itself is not a passive receiving of information from the world. Perception is the brain's prediction about what is out there, continuously corrected by sensory data. What you see, hear, feel, and experience is not a direct transmission from external reality. It is the brain's best model of external reality, updated by sensory evidence. The world you experience is the world you predicted, adjusted in real time by the bits that do not match. Now here is where the placebo effect enters the picture with full mechanistic force. In Friston's framework, the brain's model is not just about perception, it is about the entire physiological state of the body. The brain runs predictions about what the body's internal state is and what it should be. It generates predictions about pain levels, inflammation levels, hormonal states, immune activity, and it then acts through the autonomic nervous system, through neuroendocrine signals, through the bidirectional channels between the brain and every major organ system, to bring the body's actual state into alignment with the prediction. When you receive a placebo, and you are in a context that makes healing credible, your brain does not just update its prediction of your mental state, it updates its prediction of your physiological state. You also generates a new forecast. Recovery is coming, and then it begins taking actions to make the body match that forecast. It releases endorphins, because it has predicted the relief of pain. It releases dopamine because it has predicted the improvement of motor function. It modulates immune activity because it has predicted the resolution of an inflammatory state. The prediction machine is not just modeling the world, it is running the body according to its model. This is why the ritual matters. Then this is why Kapchuk's open-label placebos work even when patients know they are taking placebos. The brain's prediction of healing is not based only on the conscious belief that a drug has been taken. It is based on a much richer set of cues: the clinical environment, the white coat, the interaction with a healthcare provider, the act of taking a pill, the social framing of the encounter as a treatment. These cues are processed subconsciously, below the level of explicit belief. They update the prediction model without passing through conscious awareness. And since the conscious knowledge that the pill is a placebo does not erase those subconscious cues, the healing prediction runs anyway. Ted Kapchuk put it best in a 2018 theoretical paper. Placebo effects, he wrote, are neurologically encoded predictions, less what patients think and more what they enact and perform. The body is not responding to what the conscious mind believes. The body is responding to what the prediction machine predicts. And the prediction machine can be updated by a ritual, even when the conscious mind knows the ritual is inert. This is also why the nocebo is real. The prediction of harm is just the prediction machine running in the other direction. When a patient is told that a drug may cause a particular side effect, the brain generates a prediction that this side effect is coming, and it does not treat this prediction differently from any other prediction. It begins making the physiological state match the forecast. The autonomic nervous system, the endocrine system, the immune system, all of them receive the downstream signal of a brain predicting harm. The prediction of nausea produces nausea. The prediction of pain produces pain. The prediction of death produces, in the extreme cases canon documented, something approaching death. The prediction is biology. The forecast is chemistry. The expectation is, in a precise and literal sense, medicine. I have spent a lot of time with this research, and I want to say something about what it does to my intuitions about health and medicine, because I think it changes things in ways that are not always acknowledged. The standard medical worldview, the one most of us absorbed from school and from how doctors talk to us, is essentially mechanistic. The body is a machine. Disease is a malfunction in one or more of the machine's components. Medicine is the process of identifying the malfunction and correcting it with an appropriate intervention. This is an enormously useful model. It has produced antibiotics, vaccines, surgical techniques, diagnostic tools of extraordinary precision. I am not arguing against it, but the placebo and nocebo evidence points to something the mechanistic model is poorly equipped to account for. The body is not just a machine being operated on by external interventions. It is a machine that partially builds and maintains its own operating state in response to predictions about what that state should be. It is a machine with an expectation subsystem that pre-configures the machinery before the intervention arrives. When the expectation is accurate, the machinery is prepared, and the intervention works well. When the expectation generates healing without any intervention, we call it placebo. When the expectation generates harm, we call it nocebo. But in all three cases, the mechanism is the same. Expectation shapes physiology. Prediction drives chemistry. Now we need to talk about what all of this has to do with artificial intelligence, because everything I have just described about the placebo effect, every mechanistic detail, every experimental finding, every implication has a direct and structurally identical parallel in how large language models work. And I do not mean this as a loose metaphor or a suggestive analogy. I mean that when you look at the mathematics of both systems, you are looking at the same operation. A large language model is a prediction machine. That is the complete, non-metaphorical description of what it is. It takes a sequence of tokens, pieces of text, fragments of words, punctuation, and it generates a probability distribution over what token should come next. The entire capability of every large language model you have ever interacted with, every piece of apparently intelligent behavior, every impressive response, all of it is the product of doing this one operation very well, at enormous scale, with an extremely sophisticated internal model of language and world. Here is the key. The model generates its next token prediction based not just on the factual content of the input, but on everything the input implies about what kind of output should follow. When you write a question in plain, conversational language, the model's probability distribution shifts toward plain, conversational answers. When you write in technical jargon, it shifts toward technical responses. When you include credentials or expertise framing, it shifts toward expert-level outputs. When you describe the stakes as high and the context as demanding, it shifts toward more careful, qualified responses. None of these shifts require new factual information. They are all driven by the model updating its prediction of what an appropriate output looks like based on contextual cues rather than informational content. This is structurally identical to the placebo effect. The patient in the clinical trial does not receive new biological raw materials from the sugar pill. They receive cues, contextual signals that update the prediction machine's forecast about what the body's state should be. The brain then works to make the body match the forecast. The AI model does not receive new information from the framing of the prompt. It receives cues, contextual signals that update the model's probability distribution over what a good output looks like. The model then generates outputs that match the updated prediction. I want to get specific about the AI side of this. Well, because the specifics matter. There is a well-documented phenomenon in AI research called the framing effect. If you tell a large language model that it is a helpful, expert assistant before asking it a question, it produces better answers than if you give it no framing. If you tell it that a panel of domain experts will evaluate its response, its accuracy on domain-specific questions improves. If you describe the task as important and high stakes, it produces more careful and qualified outputs. None of this involves giving the model more knowledge. It is changing what the model predicts a high-quality response to look like, and the model generates outputs that match that prediction. The model does not consciously try harder in response to the higher stakes. The model generates the probability distribution that the context implies is appropriate, and that distribution produces better outputs. This is not a popular framing in AI research, and most researchers prefer to talk about these effects in terms of alignment, or instruction following, or prompt sensitivity. The placebo framing is not the language of the field, but when you look at the mechanism, contextual signals updating a probability distribution over outputs, producing real measurable changes in output quality without any change in underlying information. The mechanism is the same. The model is healing itself with the lie of high expectations, but in the same way the patient heals with the lie of pharmacological intervention. The parallel runs deeper. In 2022, researchers at Google published a paper introducing a technique called chain of thought prompting. The technique is extraordinarily simple. Instead of asking a model to produce an answer directly, you ask it to think step by step, to generate the reasoning process before the conclusion. The improvement in accuracy on complex reasoning tasks was dramatic. Meanwhile, in some mathematical and logical benchmarks, it improved performance by 30 to 40 percentage points. What is happening here is not that the model is accessing new information by thinking through the problem. The model's weights have not changed. Its knowledge has not expanded. What is happening is that the intermediate reasoning steps are changing what the model predicts the correct answer looks like. By generating a sequence of reasoning steps, the model is updating its own context. Is shifting its probability distribution over the final answer, because the generated reasoning process is providing cues that constrain and improve the final prediction. The model is, in a meaningful sense, preparing its own predictive machinery before the answer arrives. This is the AI version of the ritual. In placebo, the white coat, the clinical environment, the act of swallowing a pill. These ritual elements do not provide pharmacological information, but they update the brain's healing predictions. The healing program runs better when primed by the correct ritual. In chain of thought prompting, the reasoning steps do not provide the model with information it did not already have, but they update the model's probability distribution over correct answers. The inference program runs better when primed by the correct reasoning ritual. There is more. A related technique called self-consistency was introduced shortly after chain of thought. The idea is to generate multiple independent reasoning paths for the same question and then take the majority answer, the one that appears most frequently across the independently generated solutions. This dramatically improves accuracy beyond even chain of thought alone. Why? Because the model is, in effect, running multiple predictions, checking them against each other, and converging on the answer that is most consistent with the aggregate of its own predictions. and it is using its own predictive outputs as a signal to update its prediction. This is the AI equivalent of what the brain does when it receives strong, consistent treatment cues. Multiple signals, the pill, the context, the provider relationship, the clinical ritual, all converging on the same prediction of healing. The convergence of multiple signals strengthens the prediction. The prediction runs more completely. The healing is more thorough. And then there is the inverse, the nocebo, the negative framing that degrades performance. This, too, has been documented. Large language models perform measurably worse when the context implies that accuracy is unlikely, that the task is beyond their capability, that previous attempts have failed, or that the output is expected to be poor. None of this changes the information available to the model. It changes what the model predicts an output in this context should look like. And the model, being a prediction machine, generates outputs that match the prediction. The expectation of poor performance produces poor performance. The framing causes the degradation. The nocebo is real in both systems. I want to be precise about one more layer of this, because it gets at something about the architecture of both systems that I think is underappreciated. Large language models, between the input and the output, have hundreds of layers of internal computation that researchers call hidden layers. These layers transform the representation of the input through an increasingly abstract cascade of operations before the final output is generated. Nobody designed what these layers should represent. They are not programmed. They emerged from the training process. And when researchers in the field of mechanistic interpretability have looked at what is actually happening in these hidden layers, they have found that models develop internal representations of things nobody told them to represent. Models develop something that functions like a map of spatial relationships. Models develop something that functions like a sense of time and sequence. Models develop what functions like a theory of mind, all of it emergent, all of it necessary for accurate prediction. Now consider the parallel to the brain. The brain's hidden layers, the neural machinery between sensory input and conscious output, are similarly invisible to introspection. You cannot observe your own visual cortex processing the light from this screen. You cannot observe your prefrontal cortex generating predictions about the next word in this sentence. You cannot observe your limbic system modulating the emotional salience of what you are hearing. All of that happens in the brain's hidden layers, below the threshold of awareness, shaping the output, your experience, your perception, your beliefs, your choices, in ways that are not transparent even to the person doing the processing. The AI has an internal life that even its creators cannot fully read. The brain has an internal life that even its owner cannot fully read. Both systems are doing their most important work below the surface. The placebo effect is a message from the hidden layers. When a sugar pill produces endorphin release, that production is not happening in the conscious mind. The conscious mind received a pill and was told it might help. The hidden layers, the prediction machinery running below awareness, computed a healing forecast, assessed its confidence, and dispatched the neurochemical signals appropriate to that forecast. The conscious mind received the output, reduced pain. It did not observe the mechanism. In the same way, when a well-framed prompt produces a dramatically better AI response, the improvement is not happening in the input text. And the input text provided context cues. The hidden layers computed a response quality prediction based on all available context and generated outputs that matched that prediction. The user received the output, a better answer. They did not observe the mechanism. Consider what this means for the structural identity of the two mechanisms. In the biological system, the brain receives contextual cues, updates its prediction of the body's optimal state, and generates downstream physiological signals that push the body toward that predicted state. The prediction is the driver. The chemistry is the output. In the AI system, the model receives contextual cues, updates its probability distribution over high-quality outputs, and generates tokens that reflect that updated distribution. The prediction is the driver. The output quality is the result. Neither system has direct access to ground truth. The brain cannot directly read the state of an infection or verify whether a drug has entered its bloodstream. It can only receive signals and update predictions. The AI model cannot directly access the correct answer to a question. It can only process the context and generate the most probable next token. Both systems must navigate their worlds through predictions. Both systems generate real outcomes from those predictions, and both systems can be misled, healed or harmed, be helped or degraded by inputs that never contained the information that was supposedly transmitted. There is a finding I have not yet mentioned that I think is the strangest and most significant in this entire territory. Kapchuk, in his work on open-label placebos, identified something he called the ritual of treatment as a mechanism that operates independently of both conscious belief and pharmacological action. The healing response is not triggered only by the drug and not only by the belief. It is triggered by the entire structured encounter that medicine has built around treatment. The appointment, the examination, the diagnosis, the prescription, the pill, the follow-up. Each element of this ritual contributes to the healing prediction. Each element tells the brain's prediction machine, this is a treatment context. Healing predictions should be generated. Healing programs should run. Kapchuk showed this in a controlled study where he varied the components of the placebo encounter. Patients who received a placebo with a warm, attentive, empathic clinical interaction showed significantly better outcomes than patients who received the same placebo with a cold, minimal, impersonal interaction. The drug was identical in both conditions. The healing response was not. The relationship was the medicine. The ritual was the active ingredient. I want to hold that finding up against what we know about how context shapes AI outputs, because the parallel is exact. The relationship is the active ingredient. In AI research on what makes prompts effective, one of the consistent findings is that framing the interaction as collaborative, as high quality, as conducted between serious parties with genuine investment in an excellent outcome, produces better outputs than framing it as casual, mechanical, or inconsequential. The relationship between the prompter and the model, which is not a real relationship, but which the model represents through the statistical patterns of what good interactions look like, shapes the probability distribution over outputs. The ritual of a high-quality interaction is, for the AI system, what the clinical encounter is for the human one, not the information contained in the ritual, but the ritual's predictive priming effect. Neither of these systems is conscious of what is happening. The patient in Kapchuk's study with the warm interaction is not consciously calculating that the warmth is activating their endogenous opioid system. The patient is simply receiving cues that the prediction machine processes below the threshold of awareness, updating its healing forecast without filing a report. The AI model does not know that the quality of the framing is shifting its probability distribution. The model is simply computing the most probable output given all of the context, including the context that signals what kind of output this situation requires. Both systems are running their prediction machinery below the level of explicit representation, and that is precisely why both of them work. The placebo effect does not require the patient to think hard about healing. It requires the patient to be in a context that sends healing signals to the subconscious prediction machine. The improvement in AI output quality does not require the model to consciously decide to do better. It requires a context that sends quality signals to the statistical prediction machinery. The work happens below the surface, and the outputs change as a result. Now I want to tell you about the deepest parallel, the one that I think has the most to say about the nature of these systems and the nature of prediction itself. The placebo effect is not just an interesting medical phenomenon. It is evidence about what the body fundamentally is, and that evidence points to something that most of us are not taught to think clearly about. The body is not a machine in the way that a car engine is a machine. A car engine does not model its own state. It does not generate predictions about what its state should be. It does not produce different outputs based on contextual expectations. It does what physics makes it do, based on the fuel and the mechanical structure. Full stop. The human body is a machine that models itself, a machine whose operations are partially determined by its own internal representations of what those operations should be, a machine with an expectation layer that pre-configures the physical processes before they run. This distinction is profound. It means that the body's state at any moment is not just the product of the physical inputs it has received. It is the product of the physical inputs it has received as interpreted and integrated by a prediction machine that is constantly generating forecasts about what the body's state should be and acting to make the body match those forecasts. The expectation layer is always running. The question is only what the prediction machine has been given to work with, and whether those inputs are generating predictions that serve the body's flourishing or undermine it. Large language models are, like in this precise sense, the same kind of system. They are not lookup tables. They are not search engines retrieving stored answers. They are generative prediction machines that produce outputs based on a learned model of what outputs in a given context should look like. Their outputs are not just the product of the information in the prompt. They are the product of the information in the prompt, as interpreted and integrated by a prediction machine that is constantly generating probability distributions over what should come next, based on everything in the training data and everything in the current context. The output is always a prediction. The question is only what the model has been primed to predict. Both of these systems can be given better or worse information, but better information is not the only variable. Given the same information, with better or worse predictive priming, both systems produce better or worse outputs. The brain with the same biological state, given the same drug, produces more or less healing depending on the healing prediction it has been primed to generate. The AI model with the same knowledge, given the same question, produces more or less accurate outputs depending on the quality prediction it has been primed to generate. The prediction layer is not secondary. It is not a modifier applied on top of the real mechanism. It is, in both cases, the mechanism. Here is something worth spending time on, because I think it is the least obvious and most important implication of the parallel. Irving Kirsch made an observation about the antidepressant data that has not yet received the attention it deserves. He noted that it did not matter what kind of drug was given. SSR is tricyclics, tranquilizers. The drug response was always the same, and 75% of it was always placebo. Different mechanisms of pharmacological action, same outcome. Because the 75% was not coming from the pharmacology, it was coming from the prediction. There is an equivalent finding in AI, and it is similarly strange. When researchers give AI models more parameters, more training data, better architectures, and ask them to reason about something they do not have reliable knowledge of, the quality improvement from better framing frequently equals or exceeds the quality improvement from better information. A model that knows less about a topic, but has been primed with excellent context and clear quality signals, often outperforms a model that knows more about the topic, but has been given no predictive priming. The framing is not a secondary variable. It is a primary determinant of output quality. Just as in the placebo research, the mechanism of the drug was not the primary determinant of the antidepressant response. This does not mean information doesn't matter. Actual knowledge matters enormously in AI. Actual pharmacological action matters enormously in medicine. But both systems have a prediction layer that operates on top of the information layer, and that, under the right conditions, can produce effects indistinguishable from the real thing. Not because the prediction is magic, because the prediction is itself a mechanism, and mechanisms produce outputs. I want to be direct about what makes this intellectually important rather than just interesting. We are, in the placebo effect, confronting the limits of our ordinary concept of causation in medicine. The ordinary concept says, the drug caused the healing. The drug had a specific biochemical action. That action produced specific biological effects. Those effects constituted healing. This is a clean, linear, a mechanistic story, and it is the story medicine tells itself. The placebo evidence says, sometimes the prediction of healing caused the healing, and the prediction was activated by a sugar pill. The sugar pill caused the prediction. The prediction caused the biology. The biology constituted the healing. The causal chain is real. The mechanism is real. But the initiating event was not a pharmacological action. It was an informational one. In AI, we have an equivalent story that we tell ourselves. The model produced that output because it was trained on data that contained the relevant information. The training produced weights that encoded the knowledge. The knowledge produced the output. This is a clean, linear story. The research on framing effects, chain of thought, and context sensitivity says sometimes the prediction of a high-quality output caused the high-quality output, and the prediction was activated by contextual cues that contained no additional factual information. The causal chain is real. The mechanism is real. But the initiating event was not informational in the narrow sense. It was predictive. Both systems remind us that in any sufficiently complex prediction machine, the state of the prediction layer is part of the causal story. You cannot fully account for the output by looking only at the input. You have to look at the prediction about what the input means and what the output should be. The prediction is not an epiphenomenon riding on top of the real mechanism. The prediction is in the mechanism. There is a practical question that all of this research eventually forces. If the body's healing prediction system is real, is accessible, and is partly controllable through context and ritual, what should we do with that? The answer medicine seems to be moving toward slowly, against significant institutional inertia, is that the ritual elements of medicine are not mere niceties to be stripped away in the name of efficiency. They are active ingredients. The quality of the therapeutic encounter, the warmth and attentiveness of the provider relationship, the care taken to create a treatment context that activates healing predictions. These things have measurable biological effects. Treating them as irrelevant to outcomes or as economically unjustifiable soft factors is leaving part of the treatment on the table. The same logic applies to AI. If the quality of the predictive priming, the framing, the context, the structure of the interaction is a primary determinant of output quality, and if the mechanism is not fundamentally different from the mechanism that underlies placebo, then investing in the ritual of the AI interaction is not a luxury. It is a technical requirement. The framing is not decoration. The context is not metadata. The prediction that is primed before the model generates its output is as important as the knowledge the model carries. In both systems, the lie that heals is not a lie about information. It is a truth about prediction. Predictions that are well calibrated, richly cued, and structurally supported produce better outcomes in both biological and computational systems. Not because of magic, because the prediction is the mechanism. I want to close with something that I think neither the medical community nor the AI research community has fully absorbed, and that I believe is one of the most important conceptual contributions of putting these two bodies of evidence side by side. We have built two prediction machines. One is biological, 3 pounds of connected tissue, shaped by 400 million years of evolutionary pressure, running on glucose and oxygen, incapable of generating its own pharmaceuticals in response to expectation, capable of suppressing its own immune system at the command of a conditioned taste, capable of dying from a sufficiently convincing prediction of death. The other is computational, hundreds of billions of parameters, shaped by gradient descent on enormous corpora of human language, running on silicon and electricity, capable of generating expert-level medical diagnoses and mathematical proofs and creative writing from a statistical model of what those things look like. These two systems were built by entirely different processes, from entirely different materials, on entirely different timescales. They produce entirely different kinds of outputs. They serve entirely different purposes, and yet, when you look at what makes both of them produce better or worse outputs, when you look at the mechanism underneath the placebo effect and the mechanism underneath context, sensitivity, and language models, you find the same operation. A prediction is formed. The prediction shapes what the system does. The system produces outputs that reflect the prediction, and the quality of those outputs is determined not just by the quality of the raw input information, but by the quality of the prediction that was primed before the output was generated. This is not a coincidence. It is not even a very surprising finding once you accept the core premise of the free energy principle, that sufficiently complex systems that must navigate uncertain environments in real time will converge on predictive processing as the fundamental strategy for doing so. The brain and the transformer architecture did not converge on the same mechanism because one copied the other. They converged on the same mechanism because it is the mechanism. It is what adaptive prediction machines do. We are regardless of their substrate. When AI researchers study why chain-of-thought prompting improves performance, they are studying the same phenomenon Kapchuk studies when he examines why the ritual of the therapeutic encounter produces healing. When psychopharmacologists study why 75% of the antidepressant response is present in the placebo group, they are studying the same phenomenon AI researchers study when they examine why framing a task as high stakes and important produces better model outputs. When Walter Cannon documented voodoo death in the 1940s, he was documenting the same mechanism that AI researchers document when they show that threatening language degrades model performance. The prediction is the mechanism. The prediction produces the outcome. The lie, in both cases, works because the truth of what these systems are is not about the raw inputs. It is about the predictions. There is one final piece of this I want you to take with you. Something that only becomes visible when you look at both systems at once. Both the placebo effect and the AI framing effect reveal a structural property of prediction machines that has deep implications for how we interact with both of them. You cannot optimize the output of a prediction machine by only optimizing the input information. The prediction layer is always running. The contextual cues are always being processed. The priming is always happening, whether you intend it or not. In medicine, this means that every interaction between a patient and a healthcare system is either supporting or undermining the patient's healing predictions, whether or not the clinician is thinking about that. The context is medicine. The relationship is pharmacology. The ritual is chemistry, not metaphorically, literally. In AI, this means that every interaction between a user and a model is either supporting or undermining the model's quality predictions, whether or not the user is thinking about that. The framing is computation. The context is a technical parameter. The ritual of the interaction produces measurable outputs. Understanding this does not require accepting anything mystical about either system. It requires accepting the evidence. Both systems are prediction machines. Prediction machines produce outputs that are shaped by their predictions. The quality of the prediction is a primary determinant of the quality of the output, and the predictions can be shaped by inputs that contain no raw information at all, just structure, context, ritual, and expectation. A sugar pill cannot lower your cholesterol. A well-crafted framing cannot give an AI model knowledge it does not have. The prediction machine has limits. The physics constrain the outcomes, but within those limits, the prediction layer is real, it is powerful, and it is operating on you and on every AI system you interact with, whether you notice it or not. The question is not whether the lie works. We have enough evidence to establish that it does in both systems through documented mechanisms. The question is whether you are running those mechanisms deliberately or by accident. Whether you are priming the prediction machine in your body and in your technology with the cues that produce the outcomes you actually want. Whether you understand what kind of system you are and what kind of system you are using. Because both systems heal themselves with lies, but only one of them can decide which lies to tell.